Everyone knows queen to h5 from the scholar's mate, but as your rating goes up, that move disappears. What shows up instead is queen to f3, the same mate just disguised, and most people fall for it, but we've got a surprise for them too. f5, a move that shuts down this trap completely. At first glance, this move seems to go against all logic, but the thing is, most of your opponents are going to take the pawn with the queen thinking they came out ahead. They end up with extra material, and on top of that, they're threatening queen to f7 with mate, and that's exactly where the whole idea comes in. We play d5, opening up the bishop and attacking the queen directly. So at this point, the game is pretty much decided in our favor, because it's a trap your opponent just didn't see coming. Now, here's something that happens all the time in chess, especially at lower ratings. We only see the threat that's right in our face, like the pawn attacking the bishop, and we completely ignore what that same move is creating somewhere else on the board, because a single move can have 2 or 3 threats at the same time, and if you only catch the most obvious one, you end up falling for the one you didn't see coming. That's the same mistake I made dozens of times before I figured out the idea behind it. And here, most opponents, still believing scholar's mate is going to work, go with bishop to d5, which is by far the most common move in this position. But now, you just win the queen in one move. It sounds crazy, but that's exactly how a rushed attack in the first few moves ends up with white completely lost in just 2 moves. Actually, white already had no way out of this situation. So let's say after d5, even if white sees the threat to the queen, they just don't have a defense, because at the very least, you take the bishop. If they play queen to h5 check, you play g6, queen is forced to move, and you take the bishop, ending up a piece ahead. Now, knight to d4 comes in, forcing the queen to drop back to d1 because of the fork threat on c2. From there, you develop the queen side castle and simplify into a 1 endgame. And that's exactly what we call the initiative, because you go from being the one responding to your opponent's moves to being the one putting pressure on the position, forcing your opponent to react to what you're doing instead of them creating threats against you. But not every opponent is going to fall for this trap. Against more prepared opponents who realize that queen takes f5 loses you, you got to be ready for the pawn capture. And here, there's actually a pretty simple way to come out better in the position. The move is knight to f6. With this move, you take away the possibility of queen to h5 check because now the knight controls that square. Plus, you're already preparing the pawn push to d5, which now has the knight's support. So d5 is the move you're going to play to kick that bishop out. You're also going to play knight to d4, attacking the queen and threatening a fork on c2, and you can still push the pawn in the center with e4, since every piece you develop comes in with a threat, attacking something or controlling an important square. From there, it's your opponent who has to react to your game, because you start putting pressure from all sides. The most common move here is d3 or c3, and this move might look like it stops the knight to d4 idea, but it actually puts white in trouble, because you follow up with d5, attacking the bishop. Your opponent wants to keep the bishop on that diagonal, thinking scholar's mate is still going to work, and most of the time goes to b3. This, in my opinion, is the worst thing they can do, because you just keep pushing with e4, which is the strongest move in the position, putting pressure and pushing white's pieces back. And it's exactly one of those positions where the side with better development gets to push the pawns in the center while the opponent's pieces just have nowhere to go. Now here, your opponent runs into a serious problem because the queen just can't find a comfortable square to sit on. If white insists on defending the pawn on f5, the queen has to go to h3, and by doing that, it walks right into a pin. From there, you play g6, taking advantage of exactly that pin, and you win back the pawn. And look at how white ends up completely stuck, can't even develop their pieces, trapped in a cramped position. That's exactly because every move white spent moving the queen early in the game is a move that wasn't used to get pieces off the back rank. It's like white rushed ahead with just one piece and left the rest of the army behind. So the most common move here is d3, which in my opinion is pretty tricky because it tries to stop the pawn from pushing to e4. But here, you play knight to d4, attacking the queen and threatening a fork on c2, meaning white's queen is forced to go back to d1, giving back all the tempo it wasted by coming out too early. From there, you play d5 and gain another tempo, kicking the bishop, which is forced to drop back to b3. And while the bishop drops back, you recapture the pawn on f5. Notice how white's whole idea just completely fell apart. The queen came out and had to go back to its starting square, and the bishop had to drop back too. So you're the one who ended up better in the position, because at the end of the day, white wasted so many tempi moving the same pieces back and forth that it's like they were playing several moves behind in development. And here, if you want, you can just take. You completely control the center, and you've got more development than your opponent. So the idea is to play something like bishop to c5, castle, and start your attack in the middle game, while white is still going to take a while to finish developing. That's how white's checkmate idea early in the opening just doesn't work. Now, if white plays knight to f3, which is the most common move in this position, you can play bishop to g4 and take advantage of that pin. Because there's no comfortable way for white to defend that knight, because a pinned piece basically loses all of its defensive power. It might look like it's protecting something, but really it's completely paralyzed because it can't move without exposing something more valuable behind it. And whenever you want, you can take the knight and damage white's pawn structure, meaning the king isn't safe anymore even after castling, because the pawn structure around it gets really weakened. Once you push the pawns in front of the king, that damage is permanent, since pawns don't go backwards. And here, some opponents are going to play knight to d2, thinking that solves it. But this move, even though it prevents the capture and the doubled pawns, misses another problem. Now you take advantage of the pin and play e4, winning the knight, because thanks to the pin, it can't move. If it moves, white loses the queen, and after the trade, you end up with a completely won game. The knight can't move, the pawn on e4 is defended, and white has no way to avoid losing material. Now, if white tries to play more actively by pushing the pawn to h3, which is actually the most popular move here for white, that leads to a really interesting checkmate. So we take here on f3, and you really want to pay attention here, because after pawn takes knight on f3, the right move isn't to take the bishop or take the pawn, but to push g3. And your move here isn't to retreat the bishop, but play queen to e7 to first take away your opponent's castling rights. And only after king to f1 do you pull the bishop back. That's the correct way for white to respond, but this has actually never even been played. The most played move is pawn takes bishop, and you follow up with pawn takes g2, attacking the rook. The rook needs to stop you from pushing the pawn forward, so rook to g1 is forced, and now you play queen to e7. Look at how close this is to checkmate. There's no way for the king to move. Plus, your knight is controlling the e2 square, so white can't bring the queen there either, meaning they have to play something like knight to e4 and just give up material. From there, you just take it, and once again, white doesn't have a comfortable way out of this position. After bishop to e3, there are plenty of ways for black to win here. You can play knight to f3, forking the king and the rook, and with that, you end up with a completely won game. So that's what happens when white tries to play queen to f3, going for scholar's mate. Now let's take a look at queen to h5, which is also super common. Here, white is looking to take that pawn on e5 if you're not careful. And if you defend, they just follow up with bishop to c4, still aiming for scholar's mate. A lot of the time, if you're not paying attention and you play something like knight to f6, you just fall right into scholar's mate, and that's exactly what you want to avoid. Instead, black normally plays g6, and then white drops the queen back to f3, bringing back the checkmate threat once again. And here the right move is knight to f6. At this point, white has to make a decision. They can keep playing aggressively, trying to win quickly in just a few moves with different tricks, or they can go for a more positional approach, figuring the aggressive attempt didn't work out, and take advantage of that active queen on the file by playing something like d3, a bishop on g5, setting up a pin, and going for a more positional attack. Once again, in both cases, I'm going to show you the best way to handle it, but let's start with white's more aggressive options. Your opponent most of the time is going to go for these more aggressive moves, and one of them is g4. White doesn't give up on scholar's mate. They want to play g5, kick that knight away, and follow up with queen takes f7. And this is a really important point to understand, because when someone pushes their pawns on the king side like this, they're gaining space in one direction, but at the same time, they're creating weak squares in their own position. Because every square those pawns stop protecting becomes an outpost for the opponent's pieces, and that pawn structure stays weakened for the rest of the game. So what do you do here? Well, the idea is that you don't want to just sit there defending, because white's attack isn't solid, and you want to punish white. You want to counterattack. This is a principle that applies to any chess position, because when your opponent attacks on the wing without having the center under control, the best response is almost always to strike back in the center, since it's from the center that you can create threats on either side of the board. Of course, you gotta be careful because if you somehow move that knight, you could get checkmated, so you gotta keep an eye on that queen and the squares it can go to. But the idea here isn't to defend, it's to counterattack, and you do that with knight to d4. So instead of dealing with that threat, you start your counterattack. You're attacking the queen here and also the pawn on c2, and that puts white in a really tough spot, because from there, the knight is going to fork the king and the rook, which probably forces white's queen to drop back to d1. Now, at this point, you could just take that pawn on e4, but once again, we've got a stronger move, so just taking a pawn isn't enough. You're going to play d5, attacking that bishop, and at the same time, opening up your own bishop so it can jump into the attack without losing a tempo. After the pawn takes here, now the bishop comes out to g4, attacking the queen once again. And at this point, white is already in trouble for insisting on Scholar's Mate against you, and the position just can't get any better for them. What can they do here? They need to protect queens somehow. Defending with the knight doesn't work at all, because if the knight goes to f3, there's a check on the king, and king to f1 leads to a checkmate with just the bishop and the knight. So that's not an option for white, and they usually don't play that way. Instead, they usually play f3 with the idea of gaining a tempo by attacking your bishop, but you play another strong move, knight to e4, and the idea is to keep the attack going, right? So first, they can't take because that loses their queen and you just take queen. What if they take the bishop? Well, in that case, you play queen to h4. That was actually the whole idea behind playing the knight. You cleared the way for the queen. Now comes queen to h4 with check, the king has to go to f1, and then queen to f2. And now you're the one going for Scholar's Mate, but in reverse, since in the end, white spent the entire game trying to checkmate you, and the one who ended up putting pressure on the king was actually you. Another aggressive attempt by white in this critical Scholar's Mate position is moving the queen to b3. White keeps moving the queen back and forth, insisting on getting to that pawn on f7 and putting you in trouble. Most players here play queen to e7, trying to defend the pawn, but instead there's a much more aggressive and much stronger move. Actually, this move just wins the game. It's knight to d4. Once again, you counterattack the queen with the same move, knight to d4, and just like before, the knight here also attacks the pawn on c2, so the queen can't just leave. Now, white is going to take the pawn, thinking they're fine, because that was the whole point of their last move, and your king goes to e7. At this point, white is actually in trouble, because the queen needs to keep protecting that bishop. If it leaves, the king takes, but at the same time, it also needs to keep protecting that pawn. So the only reasonable move here is queen to c4, and then you play b5 to kick that queen out. Most of the time they play queen to c5, and actually, white is already in a lost position here. After queen to c5, look at that. You can just take the bishop, but I'd recommend a different move instead of just taking the bishop, because we've got something even stronger here, d6. Instead of taking the bishop, you're going after a more valuable piece. You want to take the queen, because notice that it doesn't have many escape squares. That's why they're going to play queen to c3, at least trying to defend the pawn. Again, you could take the bishop, but instead you play knight takes on e4. You keep chasing the queen, and notice how once again your knights along with the bishop control h3 and pretty much all the squares around it. So they're going to play queen to d3. Do you still play knight to c5? Do you keep attacking the queen? The line might seem long, but the idea is simple. You keep attacking the queen the whole time, and that's why these moves are easy to find. The queen goes to c3, now you play b4, attacking it once again, and it still needs to keep defending the pawn on c2, so queen to c4 is forced. Now bishop to a6, you keep chasing the queen. Queen to d5 is the only available square, so you play c6, cutting off the queen's last square. And now, notice how the queen is trapped right in the middle of the board exactly on d5. I think this is the perfect punishment for white, so they understand that moving the queen around in the opening instead of developing their pieces is a mistake. And now, you just win the queen. And now you know exactly how to punish anyone who tries to go for Scholar's Mate and just throws the queen out early with no plan at all. You've got the tools to turn your opponent's premature aggression into a concrete advantage for yourself. But pay attention now, because here's where the real danger is. Punishing someone who plays aggressively in the opening is one thing, but what about when the position gets complicated, when there's no obvious refutation anymore, and you're just staring at the board not knowing what to calculate first? That's when most players freeze and start guessing moves. And guessing moves in a critical position is basically handing over the game. So, click on the video that's popping up on your screen right now. In that video, I reveal 4 steps that organize your calculation in any complex position. A clear system to find the best move without guessing. Click now because if you stop here, you already know how this story ends. If you enjoyed and learned something new, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.